Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about a minute after people filter in from the waiting room. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with NLIHC. Feel free to drop in where you're calling in from if you're with an organization. I also know that election season is well underway, so if you're doing any really interesting voter engagement work, feel free to drop a sentence about that in the chat too. All right, we'll give it about 30 more seconds for people to come in. I see a lot of people introducing themselves from all over the place, which is awesome. All right, looks like the waiting room is slowing down and we have our closed captioning ready to go. So we should have closed captioning on. I think if you click the feature to see the transcript, you should be able to see it. But send me a message if it's not working for you. But welcome everyone. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with NLIHC. Super excited to have you all here today for this webinar on a really important topic in the Our Homes, Our Votes series, Overcoming Voter Suppression. We have a really excellent panel lined up. Really appreciate all of the panelists taking the time to join us. We have Kelly Sue Waller with the Bedford County Listening Project, Allison Neswood with the Native American Rights Fund, and Lilian Aluri with REV UP. So super excited to have them all here. Feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout the webinar, as we'll have time to ask our panelists some questions. As always, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and resources will be sent out afterwards in our Friday newsletter called The Connection. So make sure you look out for The Connection. It should hit your inbox Friday afternoon. And if you click the link to Our Homes, Our Votes, you'll get to find the recording and resources. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly Sue to get us started. Oh, you're muted still.
Hey, sorry. Hey, welcome everyone. Yes, I'm Kelly Sue Waller with the Bedford County Listening Project in Shelbyville, Tennessee. That's about an hour south of Nashville. We live in what is considered a rural county. My national organization is Showing Up for Racial Justice. We are bringing working and poor and low-income white folks into coalition work around issues that affect their lives. In this particular case, the project that I work on is doing tenant organizing, anti-racist tenant organizing in a small rural town called Shelbyville, Tennessee. There are about 20,000 folks here. We have 2 other organizers on the ground aside from myself, and we are doing, through Know Your Rights trainings, building tenant campaigns, and through electing people to the city council, we are trying to move a renter's bill of rights, and we are also trying to establish a tenant advocacy board here in the city. A lot of our work, because we are an anti-racist tenant union and our town is surrounded by a lot of racist organizing, very like some of it like traditionally like what people think of in the South, Klan organizing, that a lot of our work has been bringing people in to do anti-racist work to respond to like people leaving flyers in people's yards with rocks in them. And I didn't do a trigger warning, so there is some discussion of the intent for racial violence. Just want to say that. People leaving things during the last election here in 2020, when we had Stephanie Isaacs, who could not join us today, I'm so sorry, was running for city council, there were many people who were like outside forces were coming in here and they were leaving these Klan cards around Biden signs in the area. And that turned into us doing a large like Shelbyville Loves event. And at that event, we had voter registration. We brought in our city council and other members of local governments around us to speak out against this sort of like voter intimidation that is using like the like kind of dog whistles around race, both like very obviously and also some of them more subtle. And Stephanie did that in the middle of running for a seat in a completely red county and won. She won on renters' rights. She ran on a platform of renters' rights and anti-Klan and won here. And what this told us is when you bring people in around issues that affect their lives, like tenant organizing, like high rents, price gouging, codes issues, that people will become engaged in the electoral process because they see the benefit for them, like the reason we should engage in this. Because often when we are talking about the issues that we are often hearing about in the news, which are very important issues, but they're less connected to people's material interest, what we see is like there are a lot of low propensity voters here, people that don't vote often, they move a lot. And here in Tennessee, you have to have a driver's license to vote. So your address has to line up with your driver's license. And when you have housing insecurity, that means that you move a lot around the city, around the county. And so we see like, yes, there's like voter registration, helping folks who have felonies figure out how to get those taken off their record so that they can vote. But one of the biggest strategies we use against voter suppression here is engaging people around issues that they care about, and then connecting that back to who is in office, both on the very local level at the state and the federal government, influence those things, and helping people make, especially here on the local level, engaging the city council gets people thinking about that. So when Stephanie was running, we registered around 300 people who had not voted in a very long time because they wanted to vote for Stephanie. And we did not do that necessarily in a partisan way. We were talking about renters issues. We were talking about like where you live, like had someone knocked on your door in a long time, because these are low propensity voters. People just don't even knock on their doors and ask them to vote. It's interesting that neither side is coming to them to ask them to vote. And their barriers to voting are moving a lot, getting to the polls, felony records, and also just disengagement. So the disengagement part is a big part of our work, which in a way is voter suppression, because the reason they're disengaged is because no one is talking to them around the things that matter to them. And I think that is very intentional, especially for like working low income white voters in Tennessee. They are basically ignored unless they're being riled up to vote for things that are often not in their interest. And so one of the examples that we talk about a lot is when we invite people to eviction defense parties, like the one we had a couple, like 3 months ago. One of our leader members was being evicted from her apartment, basically for reporting codes issues. He was refusing to take her rent. And we did an eviction party outside of her house. And we got city council to come and all these people to come. And while we were there, we were registering voters. And we were talking about why it's important to elect more city council members that will actually defend us. And here, interestingly, that can be a Republican or a Democrat. It is a nonpartisan city council, but people have political affiliations, and they do not always respond the way you think they would based on those political affiliations, which is something we're trying to figure out. In Tennessee in general, another issue that affects people around voter suppression is that we are broken up in a way that doesn't make any sense. Like anywhere you look at the map, and it just doesn't make any sense, all the way down to our local wards, the way they are broken up. It seems very intentional to be broken up that way. And the more we educate people about that, the more we talk about why those lines are drawn that way, the more people become interested in the electoral process. I think that the other thing that we are working on here, we're trying to work on statewide, is there is not one process to gaining back your right to vote here. If you have a felony or another reason your vote has been taken, there's not a certain process. It's like different depending on why you got it, what state you got it in, what county you got it in. It's almost like you have to have a lawyer. So we're trying to educate our lawyers that work on it and people here that it is possible to get back. Let's see, he's been working on a okay. Trying to figure out how people can get back their right to vote, because this is really related to housing, because we meet so many people who are stuck in slum housing because of credit and background checks. So they do so many background checks on you that you can't get into the apartments. So then you end up living in substandard housing, which you can't complain about because then they will threaten eviction. And making that connection to those issues, people are more willing to register to vote and try to take part in electoral processes when they see that being connected directly to their lived experience, which is, my housing is substandard. I'm not able to move out of it because of these federal issues. And also I can't vote. So I can't take part in the process. I can't find a place to live. I'm trying to just make it. And having that conversation brings people into wanting to vote. So yes, there is like the intentional stuff of, thanks, Monica. Yes, there is the intentional stuff of like gerrymandering, the kind of intentional, obvious suppression. But we here in our renter organizing, we see our biggest role in fighting voter suppression is to actually bring people in through issues that matter to them and help them see how who is in office at these different levels is connected to that issue. I don't really have a ton more to say. I think I was supposed to talk a lot longer, but I would love to like hear questions later and like hear from other people and see how our work is connected.
Thank you so much, Kelly Sue. I am very much feeling the same way as Monica. Just so much wisdom, definitely feeling fired up. And I feel like all the work that you're doing about tying the importance of housing justice to the importance of voting is really what this campaign is all about. So it's just really incredible to hear about how that has really come into action and made a really tangible impact on the number of registered voters in your community. I haven't seen any specific questions in the chat, so I'll give everyone a minute to maybe, process their thoughts and type those up. But I actually had a question. So you mentioned that barriers to getting to polling places can be an obstacle. And I know that you're in a pretty rural county, so that can be a challenge. Can you talk about that barrier and how you've helped voters overcome it?
So part of the, thanks y'all. Okay. One of the things is that people, like, we are a community where a lot of people work outside of the community. And so they leave during the day to go to their jobs, and then they're supposed to vote here. And they leave, they come back. A lot of people, like, one way is educating people about early voting, making sure people understand that you can vote early. Another way during the pandemic was we did a lot of work here. You actually could finally, some people could vote mail-in, which is not normal here. That was a pandemic thing. We're trying to push that to remain. And also just giving rides. Like we set up a network and a phone number that you could call during that time, where like neighbors in different areas would be captains and drive people to the polls, especially around Stephanie's election in 2020. Helping, like, just giving rides, we call mutual aid, but like helping get people to the polls, like riding in buses and groups. But I think the most important thing is doing the reminders, like the 3 touches. Like, don't forget when you call someone and you're like, hey, let's talk about voting. not leaving it there, being like, so cool, you're going to vote. How are you going to get there that day? What does that look like? Do you need a plan? Helping them like think out a plan and asking us for support if they need it, or like letting them know there's other support in the community. Thanks.
Thank you. And I see that Coach Ron asked a question on kind of how do you go about finding which voters to target in the community?
Thanks. For us, we do a lot of door knocking in the apartment complexes here and also single family homes. When would be more, can we say partisan? I don't know how this works. So we've identified certain wards where the city council person is not with us, and we will lay out turf for those wards. And sometimes we will knock in those wards, but we are mostly looking at for low-income renters who live in the larger apartment complexes, because those are easier to knock. And then also in the federal housing here. We have a large amount of federal housing. In fact, Stephanie Isaacs, who ran for city council, lives in the federal housing there and won her vote. So she's been doing a lot of advocating and a lot of work, both in that role and as an organizer, to get folks activated to vote from there too.
Thank you. And yeah, just to clarify on nonpartisanship, you absolutely can target voters who are likely to be disenfranchised or underrepresented, which would include residents of subsidized housing. So that's all totally okay from a C3 perspective. What you can't do is say, okay, we want this outcome for this candidate, so we're going to build our map based on that. But in terms of reaching a population that's less likely to be reached by traditional campaigns, that is totally good to go. So just want to always have that clarification about keeping things nonpartisan. We got a question from Lisa. Is there any effort to change the requirement for having a driver's license to vote?
There are large organizations across the state that have been working on that. A lot of immigrant communities. Turk Votes has been working on that a lot across the state. There are movements for it. We've been fighting it. We fought it back once years ago, and then everybody got it back, and then they won it. But yes, there are people moving. Free Hearts out of Tennessee is working on that, and there's like a coalition of people. There is a movement for it, but we have what is called a trifecta here, but that would get into we are the people that are in power in all three levels of our governments here in Tennessee are very sure they want this, and it is quite a fight to push back on it. But I think it's why it's so important, the organizing that we are doing through Southern Crossroads and Surge in majority white areas that are surrounding these blue dots, because we are reaching people are not reaching, and we are talking to them about the issues that matter. And as we do that, we are moving them politically to understand that like licenses to vote is a way we're not going to win the things that we want. Thanks.
Thank you. We got two really great questions about kind of the logistics of your canvassing that I'll pull together. How do you get access to doors of apartment complexes with secured inside hallways? And what tools do you use to cut maps for canvassing?
Hey, thanks. Good questions. I'm in a small town, so it's a little bit different. I have knocked doors in larger cities where like there is more security, more people are watching, and it's harder to get into places. The truth is, in this small town, we knock doors until we find a leader in that apartment complex, and then we will covertly have them just kind of knock their neighbors' doors because they're more allowed to be there. And so that's one way we do it. When we are doing actual voter work in which we are allowed to be there, we train folks to say, hey, we're allowed to be here. There's laws that protect our presence here. So it depends on if we're there organizing, we're a little more covert. If we're there registering voters or doing actual voter engagement, we train people to be able to cite the rules there. What was the second one? I'm sorry.
What tools do you use to create maps?
So another thing, because we are small, We were using every action a little bit that had like van connected to it, but the actual way we do it is someone goes out to the complex, draws out lines of it, puts it out on the map, and then we print it off Google Maps and we wrote it on there. It's very old school. It's not something it's not the best plan, but because it's small, we've been able to do it that way. We'll actually just map out on Google and lay out where we know renters and where we know people in those complexes, and then cut our turf that way. Thanks.
Thank you. And I see that Augustine is asking a question about, how this is applicable, in other states. And I think all of the lessons learned here can be applicable in any community. But that also, I think, is a really good segue to our next speaker. So thank you so much, Kelly Sue, for taking the time to join us. And you may continue to get some questions in the chat, so I'd keep an eye out for those. But always great to hear about the work you're doing. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lilian from REV UP.
Great, thank you so much. This is Lilian Aluri. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I run the REV UP voting campaign at the American Association.
Oh, Lilian, you got muted.
If it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. I might need permission to do that real quick. All right. All righty. Okay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the disability vote and reaching disabled voters. So I'm excited to be here. Great to be talking with you all. So just to dive in and get started, I've got some slides here. I'll do my best to describe some of the visual elements on them. But yeah, let's get started. So the first question I would love to answer is, what is REV UP and the disability vote? So for some overall statistics, just so that you get an idea of the disability voting bloc, in the US, disabled voters are 38.3 million people strong in the electorate. So that is a significant portion, one of the largest voting blocs out there. We are also more than 2 times likely to have, 2 times more likely to have difficulties voting. And then there's been a consistent 6 percentage point turnout gap between voters with and without disabilities for pretty much as long as research has been done in the last decade or so around disability vote statistics. So the picture that paints is that we are a really powerful voting bloc, but there are significant barriers in the voting process that make it more difficult to vote. But we have many opportunities through the work of getting out the vote and the work of increasing access to the ballot that can include people with disabilities and specifically address many of those barriers. And just for kind of an overview of those statistics, so on this slide I have that data point again, 38.3 million people with disabilities are eligible to vote. And on the right of this slide, I've got the graphic showing that's 16.3 of the total electorate. And these numbers are from 2020. And one quick note I wanted to make is that this information, learning about disabled voters, learning about how to do voting outreach more inclusively is important for every organization, because whether or not an organization specifically focuses on disabled voters, there are going to be many disabled people and disabled eligible voters in your community. Disability crosses all communities, all identities. And so, people with disabilities are 1 out of every 4 American adults. So it's important not just for disability organizations to be considering how to do voting outreach, but for other organizations too, to be inclusive and accessible of disabled voters. So a quick note about REV UP. REV UP stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. And I've got some graphics and some images up here of organizers with REV UP signs that are in REV UP. And then a little bit about our work. So we focus on two things. One, on voting outreach. So making sure that voters with disabilities are registered and ready to vote. And then two, voting advocacy. So that's the piece about making sure voters with disabilities have equal access to democracy. And that's great. I'm seeing in the chat, yes, many of our leaders identify as disabled folks. That's great. That's from Kelly Sue Waller. Great. And so the way that REV UP works is that we focus on building REV UP coalitions that are focused specifically on the disability vote. And so these are coalitions made up of disability organizations, but also individuals and organizations that are more broadly focused on voting and civil rights. And our goal of REV UP is to have this national network advocating for the disability vote year-round. So a couple of examples of things that we do include trainings and webinars, toolkits, guides, peer support, REV UP grants, and then REV UP gear to support voting outreach and get out the vote work. So a little bit about what we do and kind of ways that we specifically try to increase access to voting that could be helpful to y'all. So our work includes voter registration and education, candidate forums and surveys, which are particularly important because disability is often a topic left out of campaigns and of conversations around voting. We also do poll worker trainings. There are many organizations in REV UP that, for example, protection and advocacy agencies, those are usually called like disability rights and then the state name, for example, Disability Rights California, Disability Rights Maryland. A lot of those organizations are great at doing working with election officials, as well as many other disability organizations that work to educate both election officials and poll workers. And then I'm seeing a quick question in the chat: do the unhoused fit into the disabled category? So yeah, so there, I guess it's sort of like which term is the umbrella, I guess, but there is a huge overlap in people who are unhoused, experiencing homelessness and disability. People with disabilities are far more likely to be to have financial issues, to have lower paying jobs, to experience homelessness. There's a kind of a huge overlap in population. So this is kind of a key kind of overlap in populations. So a couple more things that we do include collaborating with election officials, so as mentioned, and then also kind of the overarching advocating for accessible elections. So, you know, there was the question earlier about voter ID, and so that sort of fits into the category of broadly a long list of reforms, changes, improvements to the voting process that can improve access to voting. So yeah, I'm just going to read another comment in the chat from Ashley. We have gotten many calls from seniors with serious health issues and individuals with disabilities in our surrounding counties, either who are on the verge of homelessness during the pandemic or became homeless. Social Security is not reflective of the cost of living now, so it has put a huge strain on much of the population. Absolutely true. And another kind of, there are plenty of challenges and limitations of Social Security and disability benefits that make it challenging to actually kind of be financially secure and receive benefits at the same time. Sort of counterintuitive, but great. Okay, so I'm just going to skip this slide just so that we can get to some more of the good stuff. So one of the activities that we just did recently was Disability Voting Rights Week. And so that's one of the opportunities that you can have to plug into activities to get out of the disability vote. If you go to aapd.com /DVRW, you will still find a lot of our resources from that week. So that includes a partner toolkit, a social media toolkit, and both of those include tips about how to specifically reach disabled voters, how to do social media in a more accessible way, things like that, if those are ways that you use to reach out to your audience. And then one thing I will note is that one of the particular challenges facing disabled voters, and I'm sure that this overlap is this barrier is even increased for disabled voters who are experiencing homelessness, is access to information about voting. So there are things we take for granted, like even just knowing what are the dates of any upcoming elections, figuring out, if you're even eligible to vote, which in many cases is yes, and navigating just the different challenges throughout the voting process, and making your plan to vote. And so we do have a voter hub that can be useful, specifically to, it can be useful to any voter. It's specifically targeted towards disabled voters. We have, information on voter registration, some topics that could be of interest for the election, and then stories about the importance of voting. And then one of the things that I'll flag on this resource is that we are adding, in the next couple of days, we'll be launching our state-specific voting guides targeted towards people with disabilities. And so these are guides that can be shared digitally, but can also be printed out and shared as PDFs, which, depending on the person, might be more or less accessible, just depending on how you're trying to reach different people. And so that's one thing to look out for. The website for that is aapd.com /we vote. And just reading some more comments in the chat, Vanessa is saying that the CCDC, the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, is very active in voting and voter education. And that brings to mind one more thing to note, that if you are new to focusing on disability and trying to include disabled voters in your work and be more accessible, a great way to get started is to connect with disability organizations, many of whom may be doing voting outreach with their current constituents, and could be really good partners for doing this work. So let's see, I'll just I'll share a little bit of information on some of the key barriers that people with disabilities face, and just kind of what keeps people with disabilities from voting. And so a couple of principles that we like to keep in mind are that the barriers that disabled voters face are as diverse as the disability community. And so the sort of most common situation that comes to mind is physical barriers at a polling location that make it difficult for someone using a wheelchair to get into the polling location. And those are substantial, and the accessibility of polling locations still is abysmal. And there are many other ways that parts of the voting process can create barriers for disabled voters with all kinds of disabilities, whether those are visual disabilities, learning disabilities, developmental disabilities. There's really a whole range to consider. And even, I think, to the point of a comment someone left earlier, not everyone with what we would call a disability may even identify as disabled. And so really kind of broadening our understanding of what disability is really helpful in kind of capturing as many barriers and thinking of as many barriers as we can. The second principle that we pay attention to is that disabled voters face barriers throughout the process, which I touched on a bit earlier. It's not just the act of voting, but it can be even just learning about the elections and what's coming up on the ballot. And then the third thing that we try to keep in mind is that marginalized disabled voters face compounding barriers. So, especially if we're talking about reaching unhoused voters, there's going to be, a whole set of additional challenges that could compound with disability related barriers to voting. So yeah, I've listed out some examples before. I'll just list a couple here. So we talked about ID requirements, inaccessible information about voting, unreliable and inaccessible transportation, and things like even just physical and social isolation. And then some kind of overarching principles that cause these barriers include just, decades, centuries of inaccessible infrastructure, digital and broadband access gaps, which are significant. There's significant gaps between disabled and non-disabled people. And, that I'm sure that also compounds with being unhoused and trying to connect to information online. And then a couple other things, just inaccessible websites and information, also just ableist and racist beliefs about who can vote and who should vote, when in reality, really it's super, like, most of the time, people that are questioning their right to vote do actually have the right to vote. It's only certain circumstances where people don't have the right to vote, including people who are disabled. And so, and of course, voter suppression tactics. Okay, so we are getting close on time. Let's just see if I'm gonna just see if there's anything. Okay, so I'll just wrap up with a couple of tips for folks. One, I mentioned earlier, I would encourage you to partner with disability-led organizations who can be great resources for how to incorporate accessibility into your work and how to better reach disabled voters. And then two, to hire disabled people at all levels. And I think that part of that is also kind of acknowledging disability. There are probably, we're 1 in 4 adults, so there's probably more people with disabilities around you than you think. And then lastly, just reaching disabled voters where they are. So I think, a lot of this work, when we focus on housing insecure people and people who are unhoused, is about finding out where they are and how we can reach them and not assume that they're going to come to where we are. So yeah, that's it. And I think we'll move to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lilian. I know there's just a lot of incredible content on these slides. I'm sorry to rush you through them, but I know we'll send out all of these resources afterwards as well. We have time for one question, so I'll share Ashley's question. Ashley's from a Center for Independent Living in Texas. Are there efforts on a national or regional level to increase community awareness of measures blocking people's right to vote? For disabled voters? Ashley works with a few youth who have lost their right to vote due to guardianship.
Yeah, that is a great question. There are, so I don't want to just toot our own horn, I guess, but the Rev Up network, a lot of organizations in the Rev Up network are centers for independent living, like yourself, and work to both directly advocate for increased access to voting and connect with other voting organizations to make sure that conversations about voter suppression and barriers to the ballot include people with disabilities, and that includes guardianship, situations in which people under guardianship have lost their right to vote. And so I would really, really encourage you, if you're interested, to get involved in Rev Up, and to connect with other organizations. There's actually the original Rev Up organization was in Texas. So there's going to be plenty of folks to connect with in Texas, and I'll put the link to get involved on there in the chat.
Thank you so much, Lilian. I'm also seeing Claudia wants to get connected with Great Lakes ADA of Michigan. I'll make sure that you get each other's contact info. And William, I will type to address your question about the legal home address of unhoused voters, because we've covered this topic before and want to make sure you get that information. But thank you so much, Lilian. We're seeing a lot of appreciation in the chat. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Allison.
Hi, do I need to wait at all for the slides to get?
I think you're good to go.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Allison Neswood. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation and a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund. I'm really grateful to be a part of this panel today. A lot of the issues that impact low-income renters, unhoused folks, and people with disabilities definitely are really prevalent in Native communities for Native voters as well. On this first slide, I just put some information about NARF for those that aren't familiar. We're a 501c3 organization that fights to protect Native American lifeways through litigation and advocacy. We have 5 priorities, which are preserving tribal existence, protecting tribal natural resources, promoting Native American human rights, holding governments accountable to Native Americans, and developing Indian law. Our voting rights project has really grown up over the last decade, I'd say, and we've been involved in major litigation to remove barriers to voting for Native communities. And in 2015, we formed the Native American Voting Rights Coalition. We generally categorize our voting rights work under promoting Native American human rights, but it really is essential to all of our 5 priorities, whether or not tribal sovereignty, tribal resources, and tribal futures are respected and protected depends hugely on the leaders we elect to office and whether those leaders consider Native people to be part of their constituency. Next slide. So what's the problem that we're dealing with? One way to articulate the problem is in terms of voter participation rates. More than 1/3 of voting age Native Americans are not registered to vote. And among Natives that are registered, turnout is 13% lower than the national average for all racial and ethnic groups, and 17% lower than for non-Hispanic white voters. But looking at the problem in this way, in terms of what individuals do and don't do, is really inadequate. And I think it causes people to misdiagnose the problem and think about it entirely in terms of individual motivation. A problem with individual motivation. And that diagnosis, of course, is problematic because low Native turnout in our elections is rooted in a long history of mistreatment of Native people. And any effort to fix the problem really has to be cognizant of that. Next slide. So in that vein, one of NARF's major projects done in coordination with the Native Voting Rights Coalition was the creation of our Obstacles at Every Turn report. There's a link at the bottom if you want to look it up later. That report looks in depth at the reasons for low voter participation among Native Americans. And the data underlying the report was collected during field hearings held on tribal lands across the country, where NARF and our coalition partners heard directly from Native people about the difficulties they face when trying to cast a ballot. And the report is about 125 pages, and it includes detailed examples of what voting barriers look like in different areas of Indian country. But at a high level, the barriers can generally be placed into one of three categories. First is structural factors. Second is contemporary bias and racism towards Native Americans. And third is voting policies designed to make it harder to vote. And I'll go through each in turn. Go to the next slide. So the structural factors that make it harder for Native people to vote include those listed here. First, it's not uncommon for people in reservation communities to live over an hour's drive, or multiple hours drive from their county voter registration office or polling place. Many reservations also lack infrastructure like paved roads, which can make traveling long distances more difficult and time consuming. And internet access, which forecloses registering to vote online and using the internet to look up election related information like what documents do I need to register, or where is my polling place, or what is the phone number for my county election office. Many reservations also lack traditional residential addresses or mailing addresses. So while mail voting has made voting easier for many communities, Native Americans without mailable addresses are much less likely to benefit, and can sometimes even be harmed when states sort of switch to a too heavy emphasis on mail voting. On top of all this, many Native communities also face disproportionately high rates of poverty and homelessness, which themselves can make overcoming barriers to voting all but impossible. And there are a couple of quick points I want to make about these structural factors. The first is that we shouldn't think about them as sort of just sad facts of life. They result from policy decisions, from the legacy of colonialism and discrimination against Native people, the theft of Native land and resources, forced assimilation, and the failure to honor treaty obligations. So as policy choices in this sense, the structural barriers deserve and require investment in policy solutions. The second point is that all people are making a cost-benefit calculation when deciding whether or not to vote. The social science is really clear on that. And so for many Native people, their cost side of the calculation includes determining whether they can afford to use limited time and financial resources to navigate significant barriers to casting a ballot. And on the benefits side of the calculation, I think it's well represented by the statement made during one of our field hearings, the statement that every promise that was made to us has been broken. Native people are struggling justifiably with a real lack of faith in our democratic system and its ability to deliver for their communities. So any effort to turn out the Native vote or address low voter turnout among Native people really has to contend with that. Next slide. Unfortunately, in many areas of the country, we're not moving in the right direction when it comes to repairing this relationship with Native people. In our voting rights work, bias towards Native people looks like election officials who say things like, we don't participate in tribal elections. Why should they get to participate in our elections? Or Native people just don't care about voting. These beliefs and assumptions about Native people underlie official decisions about how to allocate election resources and end up reinforcing systems that exclude Native people and that send the message that we're not welcome to participate. Furthermore, during our field hearings for the obstacles report, many Native people spoke emotionally about the way present-day racism continues to impact their decision to vote. In this category, people testified that they were afraid to vote because their polling place is located in a reservation border town where racist violence and hostility toward Native people is still very much a part of everyday life. People report the use of intimidation at the polls. For example, we've heard about non-Native people standing in the way of Native voters as they attempt to go to the polls or cast their ballot, or of taking pictures of Native elders that are trying to vote. This picture here on the slide is a picture of a local law enforcement officer stationed inside the door of a polling place used by communities in the Pine Ridge Reservation, where the relationship with local law enforcement is fraught with abuses. So contemporary bias and racism is still very much of the voting calculus for Native people as well. Next slide. The last category of barriers I'll talk about includes policies, largely at the state level where the bulk of election laws are made that make it more costly to vote. Burdensome ID requirements, as have been mentioned before, can make voting more costly, as securing necessary ID may require paying fees for the ID itself, or for the underlying documents needed to get the ID, like birth certificates or social security cards. They can also require people to travel those long distances again to get to a government office that provides the ID. Proof of address requirements may be costly for similar reasons, or they may be impossible to meet for Native people who live in housing that doesn't have an address. Prohibitions on same-day registration mean that Native people may have to take at least 2 long trips in order to vote, one for registration and one to cast a ballot. In some areas, Native GOTV organizations help increase Native voter participation by picking up completed ballots from community members and dropping them off. And some states have taken steps to limit or prohibit this entirely, again, suppressing Native voting opportunities. States also make it more burdensome for some Natives to vote when they rely too heavily on mail voting or place restrictions on the use of ballot drop boxes. And finally, many localities decline to provide polling places in reservation communities, making those long trips that Natives have to take to vote a policy choice. Next slide. So even when Native people manage to vote, redistricting and voting procedures often dilute the strength of those votes. So this happens during redistricting when lawmakers called PAC, it was referred to packing, pack Native supermajorities into a single district, rather than creating multiple Native majority districts when they can, or when they draw lines that crack Native communities or split them apart into multiple Native minority districts, rather than keeping them in fewer districts where they can be the majority. In both cases, the drawing of district lines is used to reduce the amount of representation Native people have in government. Similarly, the use of at-large voting is commonly used to prevent Natives from winning representation on school boards and county commissions and other levels of government, where single-member districts could provide that representation. In the aftermath of the latest census and subsequent redistricting processes, NARF is involved in multiple lawsuits dealing with these kinds of issues. Lastly, on vote dilution, prison gerrymandering also has a negative impact on the strength of the Native vote. Representation in government, of course, is based on population counts, and prison gerrymandering occurs when incarcerated individuals who are disproportionately Black and Indigenous due to structural racism in the criminal justice system are counted as part of the communities where the prison or jail is located, rather than the community where they lived prior to incarceration. So there's lower counts in their home communities, and thus less representation in their home communities. Next slide. One thing I do want to emphasize is that this isn't only a sad story. Native people throughout the history of this country have shown remarkable resilience and have leveraged that resilience to make equally remarkable strides in all areas of American life, including in civic participation in politics. Recently, we've seen more Native candidates running for office and winning historic victories. Here we have in the pictures, Sharice Davids, who's Ho-Chunk, and Deb Haaland, who's Pueblo, who in 2018 became the first 2 Native American women elected to serve in Congress. And we also have Mary Peralta there, who was just elected as the first Alaska Native to serve in Congress. And of course, Deb Haaland left Congress to serve as the Secretary of the Interior under Biden, the first Native American ever to serve in the president's cabinet. And it is Native organizers and Native voters that are behind these historic achievements. Nothing has been given to us. But Native voters have made the difference in elections at all levels of government. For example, from the election of Heidi Heitkamp to Congress in North Dakota, the election of Lisa Murkowski to the Senate in Alaska, to making a difference in the hotly contested 2020 presidential election in swing states like Arizona and Wisconsin. Next. Of course, that flexing of Native political power is not celebrated by everyone. We have seen time and again that swells in Native political participation are met with pushback or backlash from policymakers. After Natives were credited with Heidi Heitkamp's win in North Dakota, we saw state legislators pass a voter ID law that required voters to have a physical address on their ID, even though lawmakers knew reservation homes lacked addresses. After historic Native turnout helped Biden win in Arizona, we saw state legislators pass a slew of laws making it harder to vote, including one that makes an ID with a residential address a requirement of voter registration. In Montana, NARF just defeated as racially discriminatory state laws that would have prohibited ballot collection and then that would have eliminated same-day voter registration, measures, again, that state lawmakers knew would disenfranchise Native Americans in Montana. Next slide. Almost done. Here I've listed some important approaches for solutions. As litigators, NARF's voting rights team recognizes both the importance of litigation to prevent things like the racial gerrymandering or the vote denial, or most serious cases of vote denial. But we're also cognizant of the limitations of litigation as a full solution to Native voter suppression. The solutions have to involve policies that make voting less costly. We need voter registration opportunities that meet Native voters where they are. One reason I'm really excited that this group is convening, housing entities to mobilize and to talk with voters and to help them connect with voting opportunities. In addition, identification requirements and voting methods need to be flexible to fit the lives of Native people rather than forcing Native people to conform to systems that were designed to exclude them. And we need to resource Native organizations and Native people to lead and to design programs and policies that work for their communities. Next slide. So my last slide here, I'll just leave you with what's kind of the vision statement for our election protection work at NARF. By getting out the Native vote and protecting our voters, Native communities can continue to build our electoral strength, impact the outcomes of more elections, and use our electoral power to demand a better representation of our communities at all levels of government. For NARF, this vision is essential to the promise of democracy in this country built on Indigenous land, and it will take all of us to get there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Allison. This has been really insightful, both in showing just the depth and breadth of this problem, and also just having an empowering message about progress that's been made in leadership and really concrete solutions for what we can do. So really appreciate that. And we've gotten a lot of messages of solidarity that advocates all across the country and Native and non-Native communities are really here with you. I'm gonna ask a super quick question. I don't know if it's a quick answer, but we have about a minute left. So Vanessa asked, Colorado's system is very voter friendly. Does it work as well for its Native population? And I think Vanessa is specifically referring to the primarily vote by mail system of Colorado.
Yeah, I think, having that opportunity is definitely invaluable. I really appreciate strong, accessible mail voting opportunities, both for many Native populations and for other populations that face barriers to voting. But, when we go back to sort of some of the other barriers that impact Native communities, like, lack of access to mail, a reliable mail service, we have to make sure that we're not only relying as a state on mail, that we're providing good in-person opportunities. And for Native communities, civic participation is really a communal, not all, but a lot of Native communities, civic participation is really a communal event. When we see our elders participate in voting, when we see our leaders participate in voting, that's really valuable. And so I think those in-person opportunities are going to remain very important for Native people and for building a democratic system that includes us and that honors our cultures.
Thank you so much. I know we're at time, so I want to respect everyone's time. Feel free to hop off if you need to. I have two quick announcements to share at the end, so if you can stick around that would be great, but totally understand if people need to hop off. So just to close us out, I know, so today actually marks the beginning of National Voter Education Week, which is one of our nonpartisan civic holidays dedicated to making sure that voters have the resources they need and the confidence they need to cast their ballots. And we joined our friends at the Coalition on Human Needs, National Alliance to End Homelessness, Food Research and Action Center, and some other partners in a tweet chat just about 2 hours ago to answer questions about voter education. So we're going to drop a link to that to CHN's page in the chat, so you can take a look at that tweet chat if you want to. And we're also going to have a tweet storm this upcoming Friday to build further momentum for nonprofit voter engagement. So join us online on Twitter or Facebook from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time this Friday, and post some content from the Our Homes, Our Votes social media toolkit. And we'll share the link to that as well. So this is National Voter Education Week underway, really excited about that. And also our next webinar, we originally had a webinar scheduled for Monday, October 17th, but we're actually going to cancel that webinar because we are running an all-day emergency rental assistance summit, which I highly encourage everyone to join. You can register for the summit here, but because of that, we're going to have our next webinar on Monday, October 31st, which will be about Election Day, getting out the vote, and preventing voter intimidation, with speakers from the Granite State Organizing Project in New Hampshire and the Election Protection Coalition. So we're really looking forward to seeing you all then. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions in the meantime, and we'll send all of the incredible resources from our panelists out in our Friday newsletter. So thank you so much to everyone for being here today. I appreciate all your enthusiasm, all of your solidarity, and looking forward to seeing you all on October 31st.